It's a year-end conversation. Dave Korzinski is a research associate with Angus Reid Institute, talking about the issues that are impacting on the federal or have the potential to impact on the federal government of Justin Trudeau going into October of next year and the coming federal election. David, what do you think would be the biggest issue with regards to voters? Is it the promise of electoral reform, which a lot of people said that this is going to really impact them, or is it pot reform and the access to recreational marijuana?
Yeah, I think just comparing the two issues, what we see in the polling is that marijuana is something that, yes, we've had 2/3 of Canadians supporting it for the last number of years, and you can really track that. You hit a 50% mark about 20 years ago, and this is something that Canadians really wanted, but you ask them to prioritize it. Only about a quarter of Canadians say that this was one of either a 4 or a 5 on a 5-point scale when they're given that response metric. And actually, even asking them a few weeks after legalization, after they've been able to kind of survey what's going on and maybe visit their online pot shop and really see what's happening, only about 30% say that they're actually pleased now that marijuana has been legalized. You've got a lot of people saying that you know, they don't really have a strong feeling about it. And then a lot of more conservative older voters saying that they're actually quite disappointed to see that this has happened. So when you're looking at the base that you're kind of trying to bring this message to, marijuana isn't a huge issue that you could score a lot of points with. Whereas electoral reform was a very broadly kind of appreciated gesture from the campaign. And people really were on side with that and wanted to see that brought in at the federal level. There was pretty consistent polling saying that about half of Canadians thought that was a big issue. And a really large portion said that they were quite disappointed to see that having fallen by the wayside. So I think the failure of electoral reform has more potential to really be a message in the campaign than the success of marijuana, which is a problem. And as we're just talking about previously, the marijuana infrastructure right now is in such disarray that it's really hard to build that positive message and say, see, we did it and everything's operating smoothly. It's quite a patchwork, and it's going to be tough over the next 6, 7, 8 months to make that message when people who are supporters are still having a hard time seeing the real fruits of it.
Another albatross around the neck of Justin Trudeau would have to be Trans Mountain Pipeline. You own 3.5 meters of Trans Mountain Pipeline. I own 3.5 meters. Daniel owns 3.5 meters of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Effectively, as the Trudeau government nationalized the pipeline and made the shareholders of Canada owners thereof. It is still unfinished. It is still incompleted. Never mind that the Prime Minister is insisting that it is going to be finished, that Alberta Oil is going to get to Tidewater. Where does this issue play? Yeah,
that was, I mean, in a polling perspective, that was one of the really big issues, throughout the entire year. We had all of these different elements. We had the Alberta ban on BC wine for a while there, and then we got that cleared up. Rachel Notley pulled her support for the carbon tax, which is a really big loss for the government in trying to communicate that program, which, I mean, we've only got a couple weeks here left until that kicks in. So I think that is one of the issues that even in BC, where the anti-pipeline voices are loudest, we've seen more support than opposition for that pipeline over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. So it's really a question of how is the government going to get this done? And when you've got majority support for a project and you're unable to deliver on it, and there's a huge portion of the country that is looking to the government with this as the key issue of, can you get Canadians working? Can you build this pipeline? And you've got Trudeau trying to balance the economic versus the environmental portions of that equation, and investing in the coastlines and all of the things that the government did that ultimately have failed to get this project through. I mean, we're in the same situation now as we were a year ago, and maybe 2 years ago. So that's one of those ones that I think he's going to get hit really hard on. The Conservatives, granted, they had their own failures on the pipelines in the previous years. They're really going to hit that hard and say, Canadians need to get back to work, and they're going to make that economic argument. And I think that is going to be one of the elements of the campaign debate that's going to be really interesting to watch, is how those two leaders, Scheer and Trudeau, communicate on this issue, because for Trudeau it's been a real difficult issue.
One that I think is going to continue to weigh heavily on his government, and that is NAFTA. Absolutely driven by Donald Trump. Donald Trump managed to make the Canadian dairy industry the whipping boy, or the big coat hook on which he was hanging his entire campaign on. Ultimately, when NAFTA 2.0 or whatever we're going to call this agreement, but when it was all said and done, when it was signed, the Canadian dairy industry has paid a big price to protect other industries. Is this going to cost Justin Trudeau?
That's a tricky one. So that depends on. This is more of a regional kind of communication that I think it's going to be an issue in some areas. In others, there's different ways that Trudeau can spin this, which actually have him coming off quite nicely. Well, we were tracking his approval throughout the year, and he had a lot of really low points, after the India affair that was really quite a disaster for the government. And is still, you're still seeing stories about that and the report that came out about it. And these Trans Mountain battles and this carbon pricing. The one high point for Trudeau was when Trump started tweeting attacks on the plane where he was on Air Force One after the G7. We saw Trudeau's approval shoot back up over 50%.
Because he'd taken Trump on.
Yeah, so playing against Trump is a real benefit, and I think that's something you're going to see is Trudeau make the kind of point that, he knows how to deal with Trump, and he got NAFTA signed, and you can't switch now because there's so much uncertainty. You've seen that argument before of, we got to stay the course for reason A or B, and I think Trump will be one of those things. But if you're a farmer out in Quebec or Ontario, these areas that really rely on supply management and have their quotas already paid, I think that the government, the funding that they're going to provide for those people, you've seen some announcements that funding will be available to try to offset the losses. But I don't know if that's going to be enough in some of these really important areas that are hit hard. And
it won't be a big campaign issue in British Columbia, where pipeline may be a campaign issue, but in Quebec, dairy is definitely going to be a major campaign issue.
Yeah, it's going to be one of those things that, depending on where you are, I think it could be a really hard issue. And the Conservatives, with Andrew Scheer's support for that and losing Maxime Bernier, basically because of that support, they're in a position where they could run on that, we wouldn't have sold you out. Who knows what they would have done or what needed to be done to get a deal done. But they can make that claim, and they don't have to really, there's nobody to argue that that wouldn't have happened. So they have some ground there.
Okay. You spoke his name, and I want to pick up on it. Maxime Bernier, his People's Party of Canada. Some people see Maxime Bernier as being, Trump 1.0. He's taking advantage of the Trumpian mentality that seems to be generated, some similar campaign positions, particularly when it comes to immigrants, migrants. How do you see that on a go forward?
Yeah, there's definitely the migrant issue is one where if you're paying attention to that, Bernier can really make some headway there, because the issue of immigration and asylum seekers has really been a problem for Trudeau. We actually found that people actually trusted Andrew Scheer quite a bit more. We had 48% of Canadians saying that Scheer should handle the border crossing issue, compared to Trudeau, who got about 32% in August, when 2/3 of Canadians said, this is a crisis that needs to be dealt with. So if you got Bernier out there with a more populist message, it's difficult for him, because he occupies a bit of a weird space in Canadian politics. There's not a lot of people who are willing to consider those third, fourth, fifth options when they're looking at the federal landscape. And I think it's been difficult for him to really build a national following at this point. But we'll see when it comes to the campaign what kind of space he plays. Is he going to get into the debates? He's going to be asking to. And is he a net negative for Scheer because of the criticism that he's leveled at Scheer? So his space is really interesting.
I have to jump in here, though. If Trump disappeared off the political landscape, if Trump disappeared from the political conversation, would you have any sense that a lot of this impetus, a lot of this momentum would suddenly dissipate?
It's hard to say because certain elements of it have proven actually pretty effective for the Conservative Party. You know, you've had Trudeau out there saying that the Conservative Party is engaging in misinformation about the border crossers and immigration levels. And what we've seen in our polling is that's actually it's fairly effective. Canadians are overestimating quite wildly the number of border crossers. They're saying for the first time in 38 years of tracking that we should have fewer immigrants across all of the different categories, even economic immigrants. Canadians are leaning towards cutting those numbers. So there's a space for that appears to be in Canadian politics that is resonating with 25 to 30% of the population. So I'm not sure that messaging is really going anywhere.
Dave Korzinski, research associate with Angus Reid. There are so many other subjects that we have not had time to talk to. Here's what I want to offer you. In the coming year, if you're going to be in the Okanagan, call ahead. We'll definitely find an hour for you to step in and have a few more of these conversations.
That sounds good. My mom will love that, having me in town more often.
In the meantime, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
You as well. And everybody listening, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.